So, when the Crusader armies finally arrive in Constantinople, it's obvious by this stage that there are very different expectations for what Alexius wants and what the Crusaders want. Alexius was nervous, first of all, because some of these very same knights were the guys who had tried to infiltrate his empire in Greece only 10 years earlier. So he's nervous about that. He's nervous about their kind of disposition. But again, the Alexius had little interest in Jerusalem. His entire purpose was going east, subduing the Seljuk Turks, and he had wanted an army that wanted to do that. Once the Crusaders arrived, firstly he insists that any territory they capture, going east, is to be his territory, is to be restored to him, and that certainly isn't music to the ears of the Crusaders, many of whom have their own territorial ambitions in the Near East. They also don't understand the world of Alexius and these other Muslim caliphates. They wonder, for example, how Alexius could have done deals with the Fatimids and the Abbasids in Baghdad against the Seljuk Turks. So for them, all Muslims are the same. And they really don't, they kind of think Alexius is dealing with the reality of the world he's in, a fragmented Muslim world as well, is actually evidence of his treachery. So relations between Alexius and the Crusaders are off to a bad start. Nevertheless, the Crusader army continues east after Alexius ferries them across the Bosphorus. Within a year, they have captured Antioch, the city of Antioch, and defeated the Turks in battle. And so they're off on a steady kind of advance towards the Holy Land. And I want to show you a video that talks a little bit about where they go from having captured Antioch in 1098. Okay, so there you see that the Crusaders, after in July 1099, finally capture Jerusalem. And of course, once they actually break into the city, they slaughter or at least they slaughter the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants there, regardless of their faith. And essentially, it is a massacre and a bloodbath. But they themselves see it as a great miracle that they've set out from over 3 years of traveling, and excuse the child crying in the background, over three years of traveling, hardship, suffering, and then they've kind of achieved in many ways a miraculous victory far away from home, over the Fatimids are the ones who hold Jerusalem in 1099. But of course, their victory is also aided by divisions within the Muslim world. We have the Fatimids, and partly the Abbasids are still around, and the Seljuk Turks are all kind of infighting as well. But nevertheless, a miraculous victory for the Christians, and they've set up a base in which a series of Christian kingdoms can survive for the next 80 or 90 years or so, or at least the beginning they won't begin to fall until 90 years later. So we'll skip this. So the Christian Crusader states, the Crusader success led to the establishment of 4 separate kingdoms or territories, principalities, if you will: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and of course the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And these were Latin kingdoms ruled with the Western style governance, which means that they brought in a feudal kind of system from Europe, imported it to the Levant, and that's essentially how they govern. So these Crusader kingdoms are governed essentially exactly as the Western kingdoms or the kingdoms of Western Europe are as well. They make little effort to integrate Muslim and Eastern Orthodox Christian populations into their kingdom. And the elites, the warrior elites who kind of rule these kingdoms, keep themselves very much keep the kind of mass of the population at bay, oftentimes at sword point. They have because most of the Crusader knights go home, obviously. So the Crusader kingdoms adopt a very defensive position, and they're very strong in terms of holding their fortifications. They're not so keen on kind of marching out and integrating themselves into the countryside. In the Islamic world, of course, their presence is an affront. Many consider it to be an act of great shame for the Muslims, and many of the Muslims called for a jihad or a holy war to remove not only these kingdoms, but any vestige of these kingdoms as a lingering, embarrassing memory to the faith of Islam. The first of these states to fall is Edessa. It falls in 1145, so a little less than 50 years later. And that is going to propel the Second Crusade to come into existence. So it falls in 1145. In 1147, King Louis VII and King Conrad III, the Holy Roman Emperor, come east and try and wrestle or I guess restore the kingdom of Edessa, but their defeat is actually, or they're kind of defeated several times. They do reach Jerusalem. They do make the pilgrim to Jerusalem, but they're eventually beaten off without any kind of victory. So that makes the Second Crusade, unlike the First Crusade, a kind of complete disaster. Okay, this 12th century English king was said to have had an anatomical similarity with a large feline. Who is Richard the Lionheart, or Richard III? And he is probably the most famous of the Crusaders, certainly in the English-speaking world, because he's the only English king who goes on crusade. During the 12th century, so in the 1100s, Saladin, a powerful Kurdish leader, Kurdish leader is his ethnicity, obviously he is Muslim faith, rises up, and he starts off in pretty modest beginnings, but he is able to kind of conquer some of the territories around the Christian kingdoms. He sets up the Ubayyad dynasty, establishing his own dynasty kind of in place of some of these other Fatimids and other kind of Christian or other Muslim populations. So he unites much of the Muslim world, the Western world, or the Western Mid-East, as it were, under Saladin, and he begins chipping away at the Crusader kingdoms. He is determined to defeat the Crusaders, and as his territories kind of come up against the boundaries of these Crusader kingdoms, he begins to kind of infiltrate into them as well. His main goal is to actually tempt the Christian knights out of their strongholds, because the Christian cities are kind of too powerful or too well armed necessarily to be defeated by Saladin and his forces. So he wants to lure the Crusader army out into open battle, and he finally does this in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, and he essentially annihilates the Crusader army. He's able to kind of trap them as they're trekking from one city to another. He's able to trap the Christian army, trap them without water. Actually, many of the Christian warriors suffer a horrible end, desperate for lack of water. And not long afterwards, Jerusalem falls as well. And of course, whatever about the fall of Edessa 40 years later, certainly the fall of Jerusalem is going to provoke a response in Europe. And this leads to the Third Crusade. And this is called the King's Crusade because it's primarily made up of the three largest, most powerful kings in Europe. Philip II of France, Richard the Lionheart of England. Actually, originally it was Richard's father, Henry II, who talked about going on crusade, but he had died and was replaced by Richard by the time the crusade began. And Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick of the Red Beard of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor. They set out, they're optimistic at first, but Frederick Barbarossa dies crossing a river before he reaches the Holy Land, and much of the German army turns back. They do have some victories, the Third Crusade. They do have some successes, but they can't capture Jerusalem itself. And in 1192, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart sit down and they offer peace terms to one another. Essentially, Saladin is going to retain his control of Jerusalem, but in response, the Crusaders are guaranteed that any Christians, so long as they're unarmed, will be allowed to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They both kind of take this as maybe a truce rather than a permanent settlement. Richard wants to come back, but issues at home are driving him back. He would like to kind of retake Jerusalem. Saladin would like to retake these other Christian kingdoms, the remaining Christian kingdoms, but he's not in a position to do so. Although, as it happens, Richard never does come back. And the Third Crusade holds the peace they make holds at least for a time. Invasion again. So Operation Barbarossa, named after Frederick Barbarossa, was a 20th century invasion by this state into this other state. And the answer is, what is Nazi Germany, which invaded the Soviet Union? Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion of any country ever during World War II, named after Frederick Barbarossa. Okay, real quick, we're going to go through some of the other crusades that happened as well. The Fourth Crusade was launched in 1201, again to try and capture Jerusalem, but it's essentially a disaster. The Crusaders sack Constantinople. They never even reach Palestine at all. They sack Constantinople. That leads to the further decline of Byzantine rule and a further winnowing of the empire's resources without achieving any kind of goal in terms of recapturing Crusader kingdoms for Christians. Pope Innocent III organised the Fifth Crusade, and actually they are offered at one stage Jerusalem as a consolation prize, so that the enemies they're fighting against, the Muslims, offer Jerusalem if the Crusaders will go away. They turn down this offer. They want to take Jerusalem and a whole lot more, and in the end they end up with nothing. So that's the Fifth Crusade, which was from 1217 to 1220. The Sixth Crusade is led by Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1227, and this actually has success. He does capture Jerusalem, but he's not doing it with papal support because he has an issue with the papacy at that time. The city remains in Christian hands for about 10 years or so before it falls again and is lost. The Seventh Crusade was led by Louis IX of France. Again, as with other crusades, the difficulty in actually getting to the Holy Land is more than half the battle, and Louis IX is actually captured by the Muslim armies and he's ransomed for a hefty price, and so that ends in disaster. He tries again in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, to try and capture Jerusalem again, but he dies while on crusade, dies of plague. And not only does this not recapture Jerusalem, but the final Christian city of Acre, modern Akko in Jerusalem or in Israel, falls in 1291, and that is the end of any kind of viable Christian presence in the Holy Lands. And the Crusades never really come back. The Eighth Crusade and the disaster of Louis IX's death on that is kind of, broadly speaking, marks the end of the crusading endeavor. So the consequences of the crusade, what are the consequences of this? The primary consequence, and somewhat ironic because given it was Alexis's call for a crusade in the first place, that had a system in the first alliance. Alexis's call for an alliance in the first place that led to the beginning of the Christian Knights. Sorry, my daughter's coming in here. Just trying to tell her step out. So Alexis called for help in 1295, but actually it ends up weakening the Byzantines rather than strengthening them, and they finally fall to a Muslim army in 1453. So the Crusades severely weakened the Byzantine Empire before ultimately playing a role in its demise. There's some exchange of cultural idea. Certainly the Crusaders get a couple of lessons in siege warfare from their Muslim counterparts. The Muslims learn, on the other hand, to appreciate the value of heavy cavalry, much more heavily armed knights, which at least, especially in the beginning, has a devastating impact upon them. So there's some kind of cultural exchange there. Some historians have argued that the Crusades also allowed Christian monarchs to get rid of some troublesome knights. And again, that's a kind of a point we've echoed earlier on as well. But some of these kings could essentially export some of the biggest troublemakers and maybe kind of hope they don't come back because they were kind of caused too much trouble at home. And that was certainly seen as a positive from the perspective of the monarchs themselves. Whether the Christian knights would have felt the same way is debatable. Of course, both Christian and Islamic scholars, and not just scholars, but also the lay public, develop a doctrine of holy war. That Islam and Christianity come to view each other as in diametrical opposition to one another in a way they had not before. And so this leads to the Muslim doctrine of a fatwa or a holy war to be carried on, especially against Christians. And likewise, Christians obviously have this developed this theory that all Muslims essentially are evil, the enemies of God, and need to be persecuted and driven from the earth because of the Crusades. Now they don't actually act out, or at least they're unable to enact these kind of violent fantasies. Neither side are, but the kind of poisonous doctrine that they introduce, in some ways, on the echoes of both societies, still live with us today. And also, of course, it influenced the Western world and not just in reference to the Holy Land, but actually the entire idea of the entire idea of taking another landscape and totally reforming it. And this is a wide range of influences. It influences forever how the English talk about the Welsh, the need to go on crusade against the Welsh, for example, and eliminate their culture. It talks about how wealthy Parisian nobles do the same in the south of France. Those people who speak a different language to them, that those people need to be crusaded against and defeated. It opens up the Western imagination to the idea, the possibility of a dramatic redrawing of other landscapes. And this eventually has its most potent form in the imperial expansions we start to see, starting with Christopher Columbus, but into the next couple of centuries as well. And that all can be traced back to the Crusades and to the actions of some in the 11th century and the 12th century and their fort. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you once we reconvene in class.